We can create another keychain. So keychain EIGRP is what I'll call this one. We'll say this is key 1. And the key string is Cisco. Now, one of the things that we can do with EIGRP, if I issue the question mark here, we have that option to do an accept lifetime, so the lifetime for accepting keys, and also the send lifetime. So again, just choosing when the key is valid that we're sending and when we're going to accept this key as a receive key. We're not going to worry about that for right now. This is just some basic configuration. We could actually set the key so that it times out and rolls over to another one. Make sure that you have a little bit of overlap in there. I know I mentioned that as we went through the slides here. Okay, we've got our key string created. Now we're going to enable EIGRP authentication on the interface. So we go into interface F00, and we're going to go ahead and give it the IP authentication mode command. This is for EIGRP, and you can use your question marks as you go through it, of course. That's usually what I end up doing. IP authentication mode EIGRP, and then the AS number. This is AS100, MD5. That's the only mode that we do. Okay, now notice my peers just went down. And we expect that because what I've just told the interface is, hey, you need to do authentication. I don't have the key applied here yet. So we're going to do IP authentication keychain EIGRP. Now we're going to need the AS number followed by the name of the key, which is EIGRP. And we'll go ahead and save that there. Now we're going to make this a little bit quicker on router 2 to get this neighbor up. So let's do a show run section key. And here's that EIGRP key that we just created. So we're going to copy that. We're going to come over here to router 2. And we can just paste it in. It knows that it needs to go into global config, so it took care of that for us. And then over here we can look at our interface. Interface F00. And we can pull the authentication commands off as well. We'll go in here. And we'll just paste those authentication commands in. And notice we just had a neighbor change here. We now have a new adjacency with R1, but notice our neighbor.13 went down. So R2 dropped that neighbor relationship with the ASA, again because the ASA is not doing authentication, but now R1 is. And if we look at R1, you can see the .2 neighbor just came up. And what we expect to see is a neighbor relationship with R2, but not with the ASA. Let's go over to the ASA, clear things out for us. And we're going to go into the interface, which is interface VLAN 10. Do authentication. And you can see the command syntax is a little different here. Authentication key, EIGRP. This is process 100. We're going to put in the key and the key ID. We just use the key ID of 1 there. We're going to do authentication mode, EIGRP. And we're going to say to use MD5 authentication. That's all the options that we have. And that now has applied EIGRP authentication on VLAN 10, which is our outside interface. And in my terminal there, you can see that R1 and R2 have some messages in the console that have logged. Let's go look at R2. Okay, we're up with a new adjacency. Look at our neighbor. And we see that we now have .13, so our neighbor is back. Look at R1, same command. R1 now has the neighbor back. If we do a debug EIGRP packets, we are receiving packets with MD5 authentication. That's coming from our ASA. We can see that we're also receiving a packet with MD5 authentication, and that's coming from R2. This debug output, by the way, is a good output to use if for some reason we had the wrong key configured or the wrong key ID configured. So let me give you an example of what that might look like. So we're going to take that key off of there. We'll use a new key ID. And let's see what we get over here. Well, now our neighbor is down, and notice that we're getting an auth failure. Of course, this makes sense to us because you just saw me change the key. But with this configuration now, we can see it's telling us why the neighbor dropped. Okay, so now that we have that configured and the neighbor has dropped, and you can see that it is an auth failure, let's turn that debug back on. And now let's look at what the debug's telling us. So we're still going to be receiving packets from that neighbor. Only now what we're seeing is we got an authentication key ID of 2. The key's not defined or not live on this device. So we ignored that key from .13. It's an invalid authentication.